Hey guys, great to be here. Hope you had a good time worshiping God with either by listening or singing, and we'll continue our worship by listening, hopefully, to the Holy Spirit and what He has to say. And that is so crucial to any pastor to remember we're never alone up here. The Spirit of God is working. But just want to catch you up. So we're on the third sermon of Deep and Simple. And in that first sermon, we found out that deep and simple is always simple. In fact, it can be distilled down to a couple sentences, as Jesus did when asked, what's the most important commandment, the greatest commandment? To love God and neighbor. You could put that on a bumper sticker. It is that simple. And last week, Jane helped us by looking at the deep part of Deep and Simple. And Deep and Simple always speaks to core issues. And she spoke of identity and purpose. And so Deep and Simple always cares about you knowing who you are and what you do. Today, we're going to shift from the what of Deep and Simple to the how of Deep and Simple. And the how of Deep and Simple that we're going to talk about today is that Deep and Simple ministry is almost always relational in nature. And so that's our how. We have a commitment to relational ministry. So if you want to do Deep and Simple, relationship will have to eclipse almost everything else. So your relationship with God, your relationship with others that you're trying to influence or be influenced by. This commitment to relationship is not the same as a commitment to harmony. And I only say that because I think people assume that if you're committed to relationships, you're committed to harmony. Well, I believe Jesus was committed to relationships, but we didn't always see harmony in his life. I mean, in his internal life, yes, but in his social life, no. I mean, people wanted to kill him and succeeded in that way. And so when we think about his time in the temple where he's flipping tables and cracking the whip, that's not harmony. That was a concern about our relationship with his Father in heaven, and that we hear his warning really quite clearly. So when we talk about relational ministry, it sounds abstract, and it kind of is. It sounds like a philosophy of ministry, and we're not going to linger there. But it helps me to know what something is by thinking about its alternative. So I'm going to be oversimplistic and say the alternative to relational ministry is programmatic ministry. And I think that's probably the dominant philosophy of churches today for their health and growth, is to build solid programs that efficiently care for the needs of the people. And so the value of programs is that they're efficient, they meet a lot of people's needs at once, but they can create a wow factor. You can set yourself apart with complexity. And so we have this option of a programmatic ministry or a relational ministry. You think about this with the Pharisees in Jesus' time. They were programmatic people. And so they had a how to get close to God plan. And it was by being strictly, rigorously obedient to the law. In fact, you see this in Jesus throughout the Gospels. I mean, he speaks about the Sabbath so much. And we know that the rabbis, the Pharisees, they created, it's still taught today, 39 categories of Sabbath breaking, things that are not allowed on the Sabbath, things like carrying or writing or cooking or sewing. 39 different categories, which God just said, keep the Sabbath day holy, right? That's what God said. But we then put on 39 ways we do this. And it just gets overwhelming. It's complicated. I mean, you could still get the wow factor, but it's not wow. It's like, wow. It's like, wow, I don't want any part of that. And relational ministry is not as common in this world, but it's highly, highly effective anytime it's been used. So it values I'll call it the factor. I really matter to God, or I really matter to so-and-so that much. And it's not complex. It is deep and simple. And so instead of a plan for how we get close to God, really, it's a plan for how we get close to each other and how God gets close to us. Very different. But it's not a binary choice between, is it relationships or programs? We all know Jesus used programs of healing, programs of teaching, big events on mounts and plains, and you could say there were programs of miracles even. But what is important about that is not so much is it all this or all that, but which serves the other. Like, what I mean by that is, are programs for the people or are people for the programs? There always needs to be people for the programs, but is it primarily a people for the programs thing? And so this is what Jesus said about the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created by God for us to experience a little rest, to renew, to get ready for the next week, in our souls. And he said, the Sabbath is for us, not we for the Sabbath. And then he said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, so I know about this. It's not binary per se, but it is good to ask which of these things serves the other. And so I'm sensing that this is a little abstract, so I want to keep it practical, and I just want to give you an example I experienced last week. So last week I was in Colorado, and I had one day with my family, my Colorado family. So that's, I got two sisters there and their families. And so we got together on Saturday, the day before I came back, and there was kind of a choice. The desire was to have a special meal. I think it was going to be pork shoulders, got to be smoked 10 hours, and there's prep time. It was a little complicated. Or we could go with the brats and delegate the sides option. And I think the Yagis made the perfect decision. They went with the simple meal, okay? Why? Because they wanted to have time to catch up. They wanted to be with the family, not desperately making sure the timing is right. And smoking meats is never something you can set a watch by. And worrying about everything being perfect. All we ate was brats and a good coleslaw and some potatoes. I mean, it was super simple. And when I think of this, we're always deciding between relationships that are relatively simple or the window dressing that can be sometimes incredibly complicated. So I think of this, I have a good friend, I said this in the first sermon, who always says, are we making bread or pretzels? So I did a little research on bread and pretzels. Bread is deep and simple. Pretzels, shallow and complex. Maybe not shallow, but definitely complex. So bread, 4 steps only. And you make the dough. You proof the dough. You let it rise. And then you bake the dough. And then you smell and eat it. 4 steps. One of them isn't really even a step. Really, it's 3 steps. make, proof, bake. That's simple. Pretzels. I got 14 steps. You make the dough, and the dough is twice as complicated as bread dough. Then you proof the dough, you let it rise, but this is only the first time. Then you prepare the food grade lye dip. You're gonna dip your pretzel dough into this, and that's what makes them pretty and golden brown. But lye is sodium hydroxide. I mean, it's caustic. It'll eat through your stomach if you don't get the food grade stuff. So it's really important. But because it's caustic, you gotta prepare a dipping station because you don't want it ruining the finish on your granite. And then you gotta prepare a rolling station because pretzels, you know, they're loop-de-loops and you need a lot of space. You need almost acreage. And then you gotta roll the dough into ropes of equal length. And you hope your length is long enough for your pretzel tying time. And then you cover these ropes of dough with a damp wash rag, not a rag, a cloth, a fresh, clean cloth. Then you gotta form the pretzels. Then you gotta proof them again. Then you gotta let them rise again. And then you gotta dip them in that lye, that food grade lye. And then you gotta top the pretzels. And then you gotta bake the pretzels. And by this time, step 12, you need to go to your massage therapist because it's taken so long. And then you come back home to enjoy the pretzels, only to find out your kids and grandkids ate them. Maybe a friend or two. Then step 14, you go to the therapist to handle your anger about the whole thing. Bread or pretzels? We always have to ask that question in the church and with our discretionary time. What are we trying to do? Do we want wow? Pretzels are wow. I mean, they are. They're cool. They got the little loop-de-loops and they got that golden brown. Or do we want, I matter. I matter. It's our choice. Pretzels or people, joy or therapy. I don't know. We've got to make this decision if we're committed to deep and simple. So, did Jesus have to make these kinds of choices? Definitely yes. Look at Mark 1. Start at verse 21. I kind of think of this as Jesus' first day of real ministry. Starts out with preaching. It's the Sabbath. And during the sermon, a demon in the synagogue introduces himself. And so that's tough to keep your mojo while you're preaching and a demon is arguing with you. Then he's got to evict the demon from this poor soul's life. And then after that, I mean, that's a busy Sunday or Saturday. And, you know, he just wants to go to Peter's house and chill for a while. But Peter's mother-in-law is sick, and you can't ignore the mother-in-law. That's just wrong. That's terrible. That's dangerous to ignore the mother-in-law. So Peter goes to Jesus and says, "Can you help me?" And Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then the word gets out about the sermon, the exorcism, the mother-in-law's healing. And there's all of a sudden this unplanned healing ministry that goes on in the city, Capernaum. And this goes on and on into the night. And we're told that Jesus doesn't heal everybody. He heals many, but not everybody. And so he's most assuredly hearing complaints about, what about me? But it's time to go to bed. And so he does. And then he gets really smart and starts getting relational and says, I need time with my dad. And so he goes to a quiet, deserted place and spends time talking to his father in heaven, praying. But then the disciples hunt him down. And that's read the New Revised Standard Version. It actually says, hunted him down. You know, they were bound and determined to interrupt his time with God. You see, they saw a ministry opportunity. There's a lot of people who need healing and apparently exorcism. And, we could really get things going. And then Jesus has to disappoint. Remember, I said it's not about harmony. It's about relationships. And the most important one is with God. Jesus has to disappoint his best friends by saying, we're not doing that. We're going to proclaim the gospel in other towns so that all might hear. He was making deep and simple decisions right from the beginning. Jesus' ministry, Jesus' method was obviously relational. You could describe it as building the kingdom of God by rubbing off on others. I mean, it's that simple. He spent the vast majority of his time with probably 20 people. 12 we know by name, really about 15 we know by name. The disciples and some of those who were close. And so the vast majority of his time is spent with 12 people in his 3 years of ministry. Even more of that with 3 of those 12. So James, John, and Peter. Clearly, it's a relationship-heavy model of ministry. But I got to tell you, there are problems with relationally heavy models of ministry. There are downsides. So let's go through this. Being relational is the genius of the deep and simple way. So it's super effective. We go from just a few disciples to today 8 billion followers of Jesus. I'd call that a home run, a grand slam, never been done before kind of success. 31% of the people who live in the world are also followers of Christ. Wow. But it's also the weakness of the deep and simple way. Do you see how inefficient it is? Really, Jesus had 3 years here, and he spent the vast majority of it with maybe 20 people. Wow. I mean, I'm always thinking, how can I reach more people? And he's thinking, how can I reach people deeper? So this relational ministry also exposes the huge vulnerability of this style of ministry. Who was it that betrayed him? One of the 12, one of those closest to him. I mean, I want to be honest. Deep and simple is inefficient and dangerous, but gosh, it works. Relational ministry just works. So you could say relational ministry comes with recommendations from the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but it also has a warning label from the FDA. It's dangerous and it's inefficient. But in the long view, there's no better way to change the world. So I want to take a look at just one passage. And we're going to look at Luke, 19th chapter, verses 1 through 9, I think it is. And so we're going to go to the doctor. Luke was a doctor back then, and he's also someone who always notices the outsider. So Jesus is always the main character in the Gospels, but there's another one who is a classic outsider. His name is Zacchaeus. So let's look at these first 2 verses. We're going to read the whole story, but I like to stop and start and stop and start. So notice in that first verse, he entered Jericho and was passing through it. Those 2 verbs are really important because they tell us that this encounter wasn't planned. I mean, the plan was pass through Jericho to get to Jerusalem and hit the Hotel 6. That was the plan. And we know that something interrupted the plan. A relationship did. And so I would just want to keep these 2 verbs, this idea of an itinerary, interrupted in our back pocket, and we're going to look at it a little later. What else I want you to notice about these 2 verses is how Zacchaeus is described. So This is the first big thing I want to say about relational ministry. It's not very discriminating. You could even call it indiscriminate ministry. So we all know there's rich and poor, and a few people in between. We all know there's good and evil, and probably a lot in between. We all know there's popular and unpopular. We all know that there's religious and irreligious. And if you read the Gospels, you're pulling your hair out because Jesus doesn't care. I mean, one time he's talking to Nicodemus, who's religious, popular, good, and probably wealthy. Next moment, he's talking to Zacchaeus, who is rich, probably a white-collar criminal, supremely unpopular because he's a tax collector, chief tax collector, and fully secular. What's funny is his name is Zacchaeus, which guess what it means? Innocent and clean. Bet he took some teasing from the kids about that. But to do relational ministry well, we put aside our common sense on who we need to spend time with. We hold loosely our itineraries and our detailed plans. We put in our back pocket our presumptions about people, who God would use. And we simply notice. We notice who God has put in our path, okay? Do you get that? We put aside some things that are valued in this world and replace it with eyes that see. Who has God put in our path? We're assuming there's a reason God put somebody in our path whenever we go to deep and simple. So we stop overthinking and we just invite ourselves to a dinner or invite someone to a dinner. That's the Jesus way. So let's go on to verses 3 and 4. Notice that Zacchaeus has a problem. He's trying to see this Jesus. Who knows why? We don't know why. Seeing is a big... I think there are 8 verbs of seeing in these few verses. I mean, so seeing is important. And Zacchaeus can't see. And so he runs ahead and he climbs a sycamore tree in order to see. So the seeing is from a distance, but my, it's determined. It probably didn't look very dignified in an honor culture for Zacchaeus to be climbing that tree in his robes. In these verses, we see that Zacchaeus may not have had the spiritual right stuff, but he had something that's very important to look for: curiosity. We need to have a curiosity radar. When going deep and simple, and I think relational is almost a synonym for deep and simple, notice and prioritize the curious. So curiosity, for me, in my experience, likely everybody's experience, is a huge predictor that somebody has a prepared heart, prepared to hear something. So we always have to triage. We don't have time for everybody. Triage the curious in your life. So 2 things: be indiscriminate and triage the curious. So let's keep going. When Jesus came to the place, he looks, he sees, and said to Zacchaeus, "Hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." Notice Jesus invites himself to his house. I think that's funny. So Zacchaeus did exactly what Jesus said, with the addition of a lot of joy. So I want you to remember, I told you to put the passing through agenda itinerary in your back pocket. We're going to take it out here. Notice that Jesus scraps his itinerary. It's kind of like when I went to Colorado about 2 weeks before, I got this email from Frontier Airlines that said itinerary change in capital letters. And man, that got my attention. I don't like itinerary changes, especially when I'm leaving on Sunday after I preach. I mean, it can't move up anymore, or I'm going to miss the flight. And so this passage should shout to you itinerary change. And You might think that, oh, it wasn't a big deal to Jesus, but what he's doing is he's on his road to the cross. He's on the path to the cross. He's walking to Jerusalem. This is the last big thing that happens before the Jerusalem things in the Gospel of Luke. It's not a little thing he's put aside. He's delayed his appointment with the cross. His itinerary was really, really, really important. Which is to say, I think this is the third thing about deep and simple. We should be indiscriminate in our commitment to relationships, and we should triage the curious to the front of the line. And we should know that relational, deep and simple ministry is really, 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 really inconvenient at times. So Zacchaeus is important enough for Jesus to delay really important stuff. Have you ever wondered how important you are to Jesus? Because you're important enough for Jesus to keep walking after the Zacchaeus ministry. And if you wonder, would Jesus stop for you? I think just look at the Gospels and see how often he does it. Thing that comes to mind right away, the woman who touched the hem, Jesus' hem. That was an itinerary change. And that he was on a mission to heal. And he set that aside to be relational. But notice in verse 7, that's the next one, there's another group that sees. All who saw it, this Zacchaeus encounter, grumbled and said he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. So just observe this other bummer about relational ministry, and that's that it is often critiqued for one reason or another by people who really matter. That makes relational ministry costly in another way. It's not just time intensive. It also means that people will critique us for it. It's something for which we will not please everybody. So deep and simple, fourth thing is always an invitation to walk out on the limb. Verse 8, he stood there, Zacchaeus did, and said to us all, I think, behold, I'm giving half of what I own to the poor. And with the rest, I'm making things right with all those people I defrauded. Remember I said he was a white-collar criminal? This is why I said it. He's defrauded people. So this is the last thing I want to say about deep and simple. It works. Relational works at a deep level. And for a lot of us, this is as deep. This is something we really, 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 really care about. And Zacchaeus is transformed. And so we find out that Jesus says with the last verses, salvation has come to Zacchaeus because the Son of Man is all about seeking out and saving the lost. And he's indiscriminate about it. He's looking for the curious. He wants something that is truly transformative. And he's willing to walk on the limb and experience inconvenience. And maybe the world is changed. So the world has definitely changed for Zacchaeus. But you know, some people, the church fathers, the folks that wrote the initial church history, thought Zacchaeus was the one who was the bishop of Caesarea. So that conversation, that meal impacted them. Some even associate him with Matthias, who was the disciple that replaced Judas. So he was one maybe of the first disciples. I'm just saying, deep and simple, relational works. We're making decisions about wowing people or hmming people. Go for the hmm.
Hey y'all, thanks for worshiping with us this morning. If you would like to continue to support the ministry and mission of Northminster Church, head over to northminsterchurch.org/give. And we want you to stay up to date with everything we have going on. So download the Northminster app, bookmark northminsterchurch.org, and like Northminster Church on Facebook. Have a great rest of your weekend.